Okay, welcome back. This is episode 8 of Mastering Legal English False Friends and Tricky Terms. Legal terminology across borders with guest Ricardo Chiesa. I am Charlie Shan. I'm a legal English coach in Spain, and I was a Canadian lawyer first, and I'm back once again with Steve. Steve, can you say hi?
Sure. I'm Steve Kahunter. I'm a licensed attorney in the United States, practiced for about 10 years out of Manhattan, mainly in international corporate and commercial areas. For 25 years now, I've owned a language services company that focuses on the translation, mainly of sophisticated legal documentation. And tonight, or today rather, depending on where you are, we're joined by my good friend Ricardo Chiesa. Ricardo is well known in our particular part of the world, not geographically, but in terms of legal translation, legal English. And Ricardo, I'll let you introduce yourself, but it's an honor to have you here.
Thank you, Steve, and I'm very pleased to be here with you today as well. I'm Ricardo Chiesa. I'm a certified English Spanish translator, what we call traductor público, and a lawyer from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I have been working as a translator specializing in legal translation for about 40 years now. And I've also been teaching legal English and legal translation and Anglo American law at university at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. For, yeah, I'd say 35 years now as well.
Great. Now we're going to talk about false friends. So, probably the best thing to do right now is talk about what it is. It sounds like it could be an enemy in disguise from a language perspective. Am I wrong? Am I right? What do you think?
Yeah, they can be. I mean, I'm in contact, I've always been in contact with Spanish speaking lawyers who want to communicate fluently with their English speaking colleagues and their clients, and they find that these false friends can be a booby trap. When we speak about false friends, also called technically false cognates, what we mean is a pair of words in any two given languages, in this case, Spanish and English, which is similar in form, that is morphologically, maybe also similar in sound, in the way they sound phonetically, but different in meaning. They may be either totally different meaning, meaning that a word that you find similar to another one will never work in any kind of context in the other language, or they may be, and this is much more frequent, just partial false friends or partial false cognates, meaning that in certain cases, that word that is so similar will not work, but in others, in other contexts, with other meanings, it will. And we will provide examples to illustrate this. Uh,
Absolutely. Sorry to cut you off. Absolutely. Yep. Some people might think, oh, I don't have to worry about that. But we have examples from our lives. And Steve, I remember you were telling a story about how you wanted to meet someone at a work event, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a little embarrassing, but I was telling the story of how I was at a meeting, was with a group of people that I knew pretty well, and there was another person that I wanted to meet and be presented to, and asked several times, can you introduce me to this person in Spanish? We were all speaking in Spanish, and unfortunately, I chose the word introducir. So I kept saying, "Me puedes introducir a esta persona?" And after repeating it for three times more or less, finally one of them turned around and said, "¿Por qué no te introduces tú?" And to my chagrin, I found out that introducir does not mean introduce; it means to insert. So several times I was asking them to insert me into this other person, and how shall we say? I was a little red faced after that, and it's a good example of how you can meter la pata, put one's foot in one's mouth, if you're not careful with these false friends. And so I thought that was a good thing to know. So introducir for you English native speakers does not mean introduce in the sense of being presented to. It means to insert into, and so that's something good to keep in mind.
So yeah, you can absolutely get into trouble with these. One that I see a lot from Spanish speakers into English is they'll say, "Actually, I'm going to do this now," because actualmente means currently. And this happens with such an incredible frequency. It's a normal beginner mistake that you can tell, oh, someone actually doesn't have that much of an education in English because it just so frequently happens. And so that's from some of the students that I've had. Ricardo, you had one that came up for you frequently as well with your students.
Oh yes, um, I had students say, for instance, I came across this particular word in the text I was reading, but I didn't understand what it meant, and so I just ignored it. I ignored it because I ignored its meaning, and so I couldn't choose it. And I said, well, if you ignored its meaning, you mean that you didn't care what the actual meaning of that word was. What you mean in Spanish is ignorar el significado de una palabra, and that meaning of ignorar is no saber. That is not to know, not to be acquainted with, or not to be aware of something. So, but if you use to ignore with in that context, which means that you don't care and you disregard that word. And that's exactly not what she was supposed to do or what she was supposed to mean. So you can ignore a person, of course. And here you've got a good example of what we mean by total and partial false friends or false cognates. When you mean ignorar un tema, una palabra, with the meaning of no saber, in English you should say that you do not know, you're ignorant of, or you're not aware of, whatever. But when you say ignoré a alguien o a esa persona la ignoro porque no me interesa, well, in that case, you can use ignore in English, and the two words ignorar, ignore are cognates, true cognates, true friends. And again, to illustrate what we said before, if you compare ignorar and ignore, you can see that the spelling is very similar, morphologically informed. They're very similar, very close to each other. And we could also say that they are phonetically not the same, but very similar. If you hear the word ignore, you can immediately relate it to your ignorar in Spanish. Well, that's the trap. That's where the booby trap lies. You need to look at the context to decide whether it means one thing or the other. And in legal communication, this can lead to serious trouble if you're not aware of the differences.
Absolutely. And people are concerned, so concerned. In fact, we have a live comment from LinkedIn to Steve saying, yes, use present next time from your friend Cesario. So this is not something to take lightly. But once you've learned this, you can celebrate. And in English, you celebrate a birthday. And in Spanish, I'm sure you celebrate a contract. You have champagne and a birthday cake. Am I wrong?
And you celebrate an anniversary, but look, you may celebrate a contract, all right, yes, if you're so pleased that you finally got to sign it or get it signed. But the two words to compare here are, of course, celebrar and celebrate. Uh, in Spanish, we've got this combination, celebrar un contrato, which means two parties uh, reaching an agreement and entering into the agreements using all the formalities needed pursuant to the law applicable in each case. And uh, that celebrar in legal English will, of course, not be celebrated. Not celebrate a contract. Your interlocutor may again laugh at this one. What you do is you execute a contract or you enter into a contract. Execute may have a particular nuance to it because sometimes it's a fuzzy word that sometimes points to just the act of signing or signing sealing, but actually it's very often used as a synonym of entering into. So execution of a contract is a different thing, but execution in English means entering into an agreement, right? And in Spanish, we do not use celebration or celebrate to mean that.
Yeah, execution. Yeah, to execute something. It's also used, to execute a person. Um, but I'm assuming that in Spanish, execution of something doesn't mean exactly that. It continues. Is that correct?
It's correct, yes, because ejecutar and ejecución are two very interesting words, very rich in meaning in Spanish. They collocate with different words to mean different things. But again, if we come back to contracts, ejecutar un contrato in most of Spanish speaking Latin America, and I will then make a quick comment about Spain proper, means cumplir. That is what in English we mean by perform. In English, you may find execute uh, with this meaning, that of performing, in certain phrases. For instance, you can say the contract has been fully executed. Yeah, in that case, to have been fully executed, especially when you use what we call the perfect aspect, yeah, it may mean that it has been fully performed. But suppose you've got a provision in a contract, in an agreement that says cumplimiento del contrato. And there you find all the details about how the parties are to perform their duties, let's say, under the agreement. Well, that in English will be found under the performance heading. And in books, in textbooks, you will also look at the performance section to know, well, how, what are the different ways in which a contract may be performed after it has been executed, right? Uh, but in that case, then they are false friends, ejecutar, execute, ejecución, execution. Uh, for ejecución de un contrato, then you would need performance in English. But the case you mentioned is a case of true cognates. In Spanish, you say ejecutar a una persona en el sentido de aplicar la pena de muerte. And in English, to execute a person means exactly the same thing. That is, to cause a person to die through the uh, enforcement of the application of capital punishment, the death penalty. So you see, it's interesting to know that the same word can translate as its apparent friend or right in some contexts, but it cannot in others. And lawyers, our viewers and listeners out there, should be wary of these words and pay attention to the case in which they work one way or the other.
Right. And then English speakers, of course, will say something like, Charlie has a pleasant disposition, Steve's a bit of a spiky disposition, and talking about their character. And Steve, would you agree with that?
I've never heard anybody say that. I have no idea what you're talking about. So my disposition has been described as sunny and light. That's
Wow.
usually what I hear. But yeah, las disposiciones de un contrato, on the other hand, they can be very heavy and burdensome. So what would you think a disposición de un contrato would be, Charlie? You got an idea on that?
Well, I do because, I have the notes that we prepared. But normally a disposition, it's a bunch of writing, from the English perspective, or you would say I disposed of this in the trash. It had no use to me anymore. That's from like the English perspective. But I know from a Spanish perspective, this is why we're talking about false friends, because we're not seeing eye to eye here, language to language. Ricardo, am I right, or am I telling the truth, or am I lying?
You're right. Your disposition is wonderful, and yours is sunny. I agree. But the disposiciones in a contract are usually not sunny. They're usually quite dark and obscure, or they may be. Look, yeah, in Spanish we use this loose word, disposiciones, typically in the plural, um, to mean the each of the provisions within a contract and agreement. Also, in other texts like the law, the statute has disposiciones. Una ley tiene disposiciones, and I say it's a loose term because would not specifically mean or one identified by number or by name. So if you need to find certain disposiciones in a statute, you will typically refer to it by section number or article number or whatever other word you can use to define the uh, hierarchy of that provision within a piece of legislation or in a contract. But it's quite common to find people say the dispositions in the contract are not that clear or are not satisfactory to us. And the English speaking lawyer who's listening to this will not understand what acts of disposition you're talking about because in private law, disposition is the act of disposing of property, meaning causing property to go out of your estates, uh, like when you sell property or when you exchange property, when you make a gift, that property will go out of your estates and it will no longer be yours. You will never be the owner of it again. And it's usually contrasted with administración o administrar. An acto de administración is an act whereby you manage your own property without causing that property to go out of your estate or assets. Like when you, in uh, common law countries, like when you lease out your property, for instance, you still keep ownership of your property, and the arrendamiento is considered to be an acto de administración, no de disposición. You are not disposing of your rights, of your title, but you're just administering your property. So if you speak about, finally, to cut a long story short, if you speak about dispositions in a contract, the lawyer will probably understand that you're talking about a provision in which someone is selling something or is parting with property or ownership, and that is not at all what you mean. What you mean is just the provisions, and maybe you may identify them by saying Article so and so 24, Section 1445, whatever. But that's what we mean by dispositions, just provisions.
Great.
It's
And
funny.
I'm sorry, I'm just let me add this. The verb is disponer. When we say la ley dispone, el contrato dispone tal cosa, all we mean is provide. That's where provision comes from, right? I mean, the law provides that you should do this, that, or the contract provides that you may do this, that.
Great. And this leads to another term that can get you potentially in
But
trouble.
before you go to that term, I just wanted to say that it brings up another term that's very difficult for lawyers and legal translators to properly convey, which is normativa. So you see this word normativa strewn about in contracts and corporate governance documentation, commercial area, and it's not norms. Normas, which is another difficult term to translate. But what would you call normativa or normativas in English, Ricardo? I just want to get your thoughts on
Yeah,
that.
normativa is typically used in the singular as a collective noun. You say la normativa dispone. And in general, as the word is again a loose word that does not point to anything in particular, our usual way out is to use rules and regulations, right? When you use this doublet in English, rules and regulations provide that you should do this and that, or it's what la normativa dispone. Now, in context, la normativa may refer back to a specific statute, for instance, and in that case, it's the law. So you can translate it as the law by reference. I mean, because of referential synonymy, you know that it's used to mean una ley en particular, one statute, one act in particular. Otherwise, if the context will not help, it's safer, I think, to use a doublet like that one, rules and regulations, or probably regulations alone in some cases, but it's
We
highly
actually
context dependent.
I like legal provisions.
Or legal provisions.
It's that
Yeah,
general fuzzy term. It could mean many things, and so we usually refer to legal provisions generally as the functional equivalent, more or less.
agreed. I think it's broad enough to cover what we mean by normativa in general. Yeah.
Yeah, Cesario's coming in hot, saying in Spain they use stipulations, clauses, pacts, and accords.
Well,
And
they use the Spanish terms, estipulaciones, cláusulas, pactos. Yeah,
O
oh, I would
acuerdos.
yeah.
Exactly. That's quite true. Disposiciones in Spain is typically reserved for the law, or I mean, for rules and regulations, let's say, and not for contracts. But in Latin America, in Spanish speaking America, yeah, we do use it a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, for anyone listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, we do these live on LinkedIn, so you can comment and then we can bring it up and etc. And the next term it was got me thinking because it's just February. Some of us may or may not have had New Year's resolutions to quit smoking, and maybe go to the gym and things like that. And this might get you in trouble if maybe you resolve to learn legal English. You might want to start with this term. Steve or Ricardo, what do you think? Is it exactly the same? Can you get into trouble with this?
In the legal context,
Yeah,
absolutely,
a resolution.
absolutely.
We've all resolved to quit smoking potentially.
Yeah, that's another one of
Count
those
count me
false
out.
cognates, right? I'm still trying. I'm still trying, but well, Ricardo will let you jump in on this, but yeah, that's another example of a false friend when people say resolution for the Spanish resolución. Ricardo,
Yeah,
do you want to jump in on
and
that?
Charlie, it's a good thing that you bring it up this way because we should draw another difference that we did not mention before, and it is that uh, two two given words like these we're discussing may be true cognates in what we call the general language, right? General Spanish, general English. This is the case of resolución and resolution when you speak about, for instance, New Year resolutions. That's all right. I mean, the word works and it works vice versa in both directions, right? But when we speak about not the general language, but specialized language like legal English or legal Spanish, the false cognates come up. Uh, resolution in legal Spanish is maybe used with different meanings. Again, can be used differently. For example, if it is una resolución judicial, meaning un acto de un juez o de un tribunal que decide algo, in English you will not call that a resolution at all. It will be a decision. Or you may use more specific words pointing to the nature of that decision, like order, for instance. But you would never say resolution to speak of the decision itself. Now,
You
the
could
interesting nuance.
in certain contexts. I think you could, but not if you're talking about a case. I think, but if you're talking about issues, the court does resolve issues.
Oh, yeah,
You
well,
could
all right, all
you
right. But that's also interesting that now you also need to look at what we call the word class. It's not the same thing to speak about the noun and the verb properly.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the false cognates are resolución and resolution, but not necessarily resolver and resolve. Let me make this clear. As I said, a judge issues a resolution or a decision, sorry, renders a decision, emite, dicta una resolución. However, this is what we call the static meaning, the products of your process of thinking. But the dynamic meaning, the act of resolving, is also called resolution. And I'll give you an example right away. And in that case, the English is the cognate resolution. For example, What did the lawyers do pending resolution of the case? In that sentence, resolution has a dynamic feel to it. Pending resolution of the case means while or until the case was resolved by the courts. When
Or
resolution
decided.
then
Yeah.
has this dynamic meaning that of deciding, the process of deciding, the two words are cognates, right? Now, the product of that process is a particular order, for instance. We call it a resolution, but in English, you do not call it a resolution if it is, if we are talking about the judicial sphere. In the corporate field, it's different. Uh, in Latin America, not in Spain, a board of directors, for instance, what we call directorio or consejo de administración, may, or the meeting of shareholders, may adopt, we say, resoluciones. In Spain, they're called
Uh-huh.
acuerdos, right? They do not use resolución to this. But in English, if you compare the Latin American resolution and the English resolution, they are true cognates. It's all right. Yes, the board of directors adopts resolutions, the shareholders at meeting adopt resolutions, and so on and so forth. And so, in that case, you cannot, let's say, expand the problem in one field, the judicial sphere, for instance, to another one, the corporate field. That's why it may be a bit tricky. But to make it simpler, resolución de un juez, decision of a court. Resolución de una junta de accionistas or asamblea, as we call it here, de accionistas, resolution English. And I insist, resolución in that sense is acuerdo in Spain, right? And then you get the resolución de un contrato as one of the acts by means of which a contract may come to an end or may be put to an end. In most, I mean, the not all laws will govern resolution exactly the same way, that is, providing for the same reasons why a contract may be resuelto. But in general, resolution occurs when one of the parties breaches the agreement and the other party is entitled to terminate it, to put an end to it. That is the non breaching party. Uh, it also applies when a condition subsequent occurs, una condición suspensiva, resolutoria, and in that case, the contract is terminated. Well, in English, you do not use resolution or result, except in Louisiana in the United States, of course. And the typical word you will use is terminate or termination. For so if you say that the contract has been resolved, maybe your interlocutor, an English-speaking client or lawyer, will wonder what you mean by results, because in their mind, this will lead to the meaning of finding a solution to it, and what you mean is it has been terminated. So that's where the false friends, where the false friends appear, right?
Yeah.
Our resolver, then terminate in English, resolution, termination. There may be other possible equivalents in English as well, but for the purposes of this discussion, just that one may be enough.
Yeah, so resolution can be a decision from the court. It can also be a termination of a contract. So that one's a bit tricky. Another one, as someone who helps people with English, you can say you need to write or speak with full sentences. Or as a lawyer, I could say you're facing 5 years. You're facing being sentenced for 5 years in prison. And sentence also can throw you through a loop because it doesn't exactly make sense, Spanish to English. Uh, what do you think?
Yeah, because it's so similar to the Spanish sentencia. And the word sentencia in Spanish is used broadly to mean the decision of a court. It may be an intermediate decision. In that case, we call it an interlocutory decision, sentencia interlocutoria, or a final decision, the one that puts an end to the proceeding at a certain instance, say, or level. And that sentencia may be issued by any kind of court, maybe a civil court, a court dealing in commercial matters, in criminal matters, in employment and labor matters, and it's always a sentencia. And this is a gross mistake in English. If you say that the court has issued a sentence when you mean sentencia, because sentence in English to begin with is used only in the criminal sphere. And it is not just an order, but it's the penalty imposed by a criminal court, right? So whenever you want to use to mean our sentencia in English, use decision. Or if you know the kind of decision it is, it may be order, for instance, or ruling. But remember that sentence is used only in the criminal field to mean what we mean by pena, o el tipo de condena impuesta.
Okay, great. Now, another one that comes up in English, it's in really common English, is an injury. You know, maybe one of us secretly could say, I go to CrossFit and I'm worried about getting injured. And you maybe, from a Spanish perspective, someone could, insult them. And then you can get it right in every language. But is an injury, like a physical injury in Spanish? How does this translate to legal English and how lawyers can get in trouble?
It brings to mind injuria. Ricardo, how would you typically use injuria in Spanish? Me
Uh,
sufrió una injuria, or
no, it's as it is a delito, it is an offense, crime. Um, we can say that lo acusaron del delito de injurias. In general, we use it in the plural, we say injurias. If we mean an injuria in the general language as a comment that is derogatory or that harms somebody's reputation, well, that would be an insult, for instance, right? But in the criminal, we use this one in the criminal field to mean the act of what in English you call defamation of character, that is, speaking or writing ill about somebody and thus harming their good name and reputation, right? So, but injury in English points to some kind of harm you've suffered, typically physically, but not necessarily. It may also be emotionally. And in legal English, you will also find the phrase to injure somebody's rights, something intangible as rights may be injured, meaning prejudiced. Uh,
prejudice? Yeah.
exactly. But now, what I mean is that if you're talking about this particular crime, that of injurias or injurias graves, we having some legislations, uh, in English you should not use injury because that will get the other person thinking about, yes, something physical typically. And what we mean is, yes, typically defamation of character, which may again take the form of slander or libel, right? Whether it is depending on whether the insult or the harm is perpetrated by means of a more or less transient means, like when talking or making gestures or by any kind of sign, that's slander, or through a means that is considered to be more permanent, like in writing. In that case, it's libel, but not injury.
But there's a related point that you alluded to, is that in Latin America and other civil law jurisdictions, injuria or defamation is actually a criminal matter, whereas in the United States, it's a civil matter. So you don't go to the police over defamation. You can go to the court, the civil courts, but in civil law jurisdictions, this is always going to be both civil and criminal. But I do know that you can be subject to criminal liability for defamation. Um, Ricardo, and I think it's
Yeah,
important that maybe if you're explaining local law to an English speaking person, you may want to actually specify, criminal defamation as opposed to simply defamation, which would
that's
typically be
true.
a civil law matter.
That's quite correct because defamation of character to begin with is a tort. That is a civil wrong, and it may or may not be a crime depending on the jurisdiction. It also applies to slander and libel. One of the two is or is not a crime, and it depends on the jurisdiction. But in a country like Argentina, it's a crime. So if you want to report somebody because that somebody has te ha injuriado, you go to court. But although it is not classified as a tort, we do not have that classification actually in common law legislations, in civil law legislations. Um, what you can do is file for damages. You can file an action for damages to your good name and reputation. So it may become a civil matter as well. Yeah.
I really like defamation as one of my kind of favorite terms because if that is the type of law you're practicing, that is what you will tell the client, but they will probably call you with much more colorful language about what has happened. And then you
Yeah.
have to say, well, this sounds like a case of defamation. I would never call Steve and say, I have been defamed. You
Yeah. Of
know,
course.
what shall we do pursuant to these occurrences?
Of
Now,
course not.
the next one, I'm not sure, is a false friend. So, doctrine, is it not the same?
Nope.
Well,
This drives us nuts, us legal translators. This word. Go ahead, Ricardo.
no, yeah, but doctrina is and doctrine is again an interesting pair because again we've got this issue about partial false cognates, total false cognates. Look, when doctrina is used in Spanish to mean a set of thoughts about something, I mean something like a theory or a proposition, uh, it's all right. We say la doctrina del enriquecimiento ilícito. All right. In English, you can use doctrine and say the doctrine of unjust enrichment, the doctrine of unforeseen circumstances, and whatever doctrine you may think of. Doctrines come up all the time. I mean, scholars uh, provide names to what they call doctrines all the time, but it's just a set of propositions about a particular topic. But we use the word doctrina in Spanish speaking countries in a different way as a source of law. In Spanish, we typically say we've got four main sources of law, fuentes del derecho, I would say la ley, la jurisprudencia, la costumbre y la doctrina. La doctrina, not doctrina, una doctrina. La doctrina. We always use the definite article. And when we say la doctrina, we mean the body of texts, scholarly texts, produced by jurists, scholars, or lawyers who write about a particular topic in the form of textbooks, commentary, that is, comments on judicial decisions, monographs, papers of all kinds. And in a country like Argentina, like Chile, like Uruguay, and many others, many people argue, and I would say they're right, that la doctrina es una fuente del derecho más importante que la jurisprudencia. That is, that body of texts produced by scholars carries more weight than what we may call case law. That's because of the obvious differences between the civil law tradition and the common law tradition. The common law tradition, rests upon precedents and case law much more heavily than courts in the civil law tradition. And when we mean that, la doctrina, in English we may say legal scholarship if we use a word that points to something objective, or we may use what we call metonymy and say legal scholars. La doctrina opina tal cosa. Well, legal scholars, or many legal scholars, are of the opinion that, or think that, say that, and so on and so forth. Or we can say, I don't know, legal textbooks and commentary. I mean, you can build up a phrase that denotes all that production, that collective uh, body, let's say, of texts produced by scholarships, by
And
scholars.
this is important because the term is used so often in pleadings or briefs to the court that if you're a Spanish lawyer or a Spanish speaking lawyer and needing to explain the term to your client, or to another attorney, if you start talking about doctrine, you're going to get a quizzical look from the other party. And so this is why what Ricardo is saying is so important, to understand that, in the civil law jurisdictions, the courts will often take arguments based on this legal scholarship or doctrina more seriously than what a court may have decided on this particular issue before, because they don't have this stare decisis, uh, case law fixation that the common law does. So, in the common law jurisdictions, a judge is going to be more impressed by you bringing up a certain case on point that they should follow due to the principle of stare decisis. Whereas in the civil law jurisdiction, the judge is not so concerned about what that same level court may have decided previously, and would be more impressed by what you can bring to them as to what famous legal scholars have stated on the issue. And that is a big difference in the features of the two legal systems.
Exactly. Steve, you and I have been working together for more than 20 years, and among the documents we have had to translate into English, uh, there have been um, pleadings, especially complaints or answers to complaints. And I have also worked on many of those materials for law firms here. And I remember a couple of cases in which a person from the United States asked me, how was it possible that a pleading, a complaint, for instance, contained, or running to, I don't know, 50 pages, contained no fewer than 25 pages devoted to quotes from textbooks by legal authors and not case law. I think they were impressed and I think astounded by the weight that what we call la doctrina carries in pleading, in arguing your case, right? And of course, they found it awfully boring to read, most probably. Apart from that, I mean, apart from how impressed they were, I guess that they were terribly bored. But all these pleadings are full of footnotes uh, to mention the author, the particular book from which the quotes have been taken. And that's very important for a translator to know when they have to face this kind of translation work, whether or not the footnotes, for instance, pointing to all that need to be translated at all.
Okay, great. Now, I was thinking about the next term in general English, is prescription. So if I get sick, I'll go see the doctor and I'll get a prescription for a medication. And because it's on Mastering Legal English, the story just can't end there. And it looks like this one gets even more complicated in a way than doctrine, which, as a common law lawyer, I would just forget about and hope it didn't matter and skip those 25 pages. So, a prescription, Ricardo, what are they talking about? Are they talking about antibiotics?
Well, the point is that a prescription is very similar to prescripción, which is one of the key concepts, uh, both in private, in substantive law like law of contracts and commercial law, business law, and in the law of procedure. And la prescripción may be basically of two kinds. It may be the It has to do with the lapse of time. Let's put it that way. We all know that prescription has to do with the effects of the passage of time on certain acts. And it may mean that you lose the right to do something because time has passed, or the opposite, quite the opposite. It may mean that you acquire a right thanks to the fact that time has passed. In one case, in the first case, what we mean is prescripción liberatoria, and in the other case, prescripción adquisitiva. Well, again, apart from leaving Louisiana apart, where you will find liberative and acquisitive prescription in the code, what we mean by prescription, what we mean, the effect of the passage of time on an obligation you had, which is now gone because time has passed and you're no longer liable, for instance, that in English is the statute of limitations, or a limitations period if you focus on the period itself. Uh, por ejemplo, el verbo es prescribir, and we say, la deuda ha prescrito. Han pasado, por ejemplo, 5 años, los plazos pueden ser distintos, y la deuda ha prescrito. Meaning, I, as the debtor, I'm no longer liable for that debt because the statute of limitations has run, or has run out, or has expired. Um, so you say that the other party who had a claim, I was the debtor, the other one's the creditor. So I had a debt, the other party has had a claim. That claim, you say in English, is statute barred. In Spanish, we say la acción está prescrita or prescripta. In Uruguay and Argentina, you know that we still use the P to that suffix. Well, anyway, but la deuda está prescripta, la acción está prescripta. El acreedor ya no puede iniciar una acción para cobrar. The creditor is no longer entitled to bring an action to claim payment of that debt. So the claim is statute barred, barred by the statute of limitations.
And I just want to add that it's not incorrect to say that you are prescribed from bringing an action. That there it's actually okay to use prescription in that sense. You are prescribed, or the action is prescribed. But
Yeah,
generally, as Ricardo's saying, that's not, you wouldn't use that term, um, especially the now the word prescription as opposed to the verb prescribe.
oh yes. And again, this is one of the cases in which you would sound funny. You say, yeah, well, the problem is that we are facing prescription and we need to act quickly because otherwise our action would be prescribed. And your
And if
interlocutor
I
is
was the lawyer on the
a
other side, I'd say,
physician.
"Huh? What?"
What? And the other case, the opposite case is that of acquiring property, the title to property, to put it more accurately, because of the passage of time. Uh, 10 years, 20 years, it depends. But you may, if you are the occupant of otherwise vacant property and you're there for 20 years and you fulfill a number of conditions and requirements imposed by law, that is to be the continuous and hostile owner and whatever, uh, you say that you acquire that property. In Spanish, we say por prescripción adquisitiva. In English, the typical functional equivalent is adverse possession. That is, you acquire title to certain property through or by means of adverse possession, but not by prescription. And I insist, unless it's Louisiana.
Great. Now the next one, is in use. You can be required. It could be a requirement, like normal basic English. Let's say you're a lawyer at a law firm and you sleep in and your boss gets upset and it says it's a requirement as an employee of this law firm to show up on time. But this is a false friend because the court can also have a requirement of people. And
Yeah,
it's just not as big a, I mean, they're both pretty serious. You want to, if it's a requirement for work, that could be, you could get into trouble. You could find yourself out of a job. But if the court has a requirement of you, they don't call it a requirement. It's a bit scarier. Your client won't like it. You won't like it. So it's a court's requirement. It's a false friend because they don't say requirement, right?
no, because again, the pair to compare here is requerimiento and requirement. And the thing is that both the word requirement in English uh, points to something that must be done or that must be complied with, satisfied, fulfilled as a condition, let's say a precondition for doing something else. Uh, as such, it's the word is again static in meaning, but requerimiento in Spanish is the act of doing something. Es el acto de requerir. So it's dynamic in meaning, like our resolution mentioned before. It's again dynamic. And un requerimiento fiscal, for example, that one you wouldn't like, Charlie or Steve. I mean, it's the tax authority asking you or demanding from you that you pay something that was unpaid. That's a requerimiento. And you would never call it a requirement because requirement is kind of a dead word. You need a live word that points to the act of doing something. And it's, in this case, order, demand for payment, for instance. Depends on the context, right? But it's only too often that we find people using I got a requirement from the court, for instance, or from the tax authority. You can't say it. I mean, no one will understand what you mean by I got a requirement, right? What I
I mean,
got is
it is a
demand.
requirement, but it's this example of genus and species that Ricardo likes to talk about. That it's a specific type of requirement, and to refer to the general term would be nonsensical for
Exactly,
another lawyer, especially.
exactly, exactly. Um, and let me just add one to our list, Charlie. Um, when we're talking about a court, for instance, maybe any other kind of authority, but if it is a judicial authority, in legal Spanish everywhere, we use a lot the phrase de oficio. El juez decide algo de oficio, hace algo de oficio. And this phrase is often mistranslated into English as ex officio, which is very similar in form. It's a Latin phrase, but very similar in form to our de oficio. And it is not correct because the meaning is again different. When we say de oficio, speaking about a court, what we mean is on the court's own initiative, on the court's own motion, that is, without any party or either of the litigants asking for that particular measure or order. Uh, Whereas ex officio in English is used to mean because of the position you hold. Uh, for example, a common one is in corporate matters. The president or chair of a company is an ex officio member of all committees of the board of directors. Because of his or her position as such, as the president or chair, he or she is an ex officio member, meaning they need no appointments to that committee, right? In Spanish, that's what we mean by miembro nato, like a born member of that committee. So if you use ex officio for de officio, what you will mean if you say the court decided this or that ex officio, you mean because he or she is a judge. But that is not the meaning. The meaning is that he or she did it on its own initiative, on its own motion, because the law allows them to act that way. And the Latin word, if you want to use a Latin one, in English to use in that case is sua sponte, right? Which is a very common Latin phrase in legal English and not at all common in legal Spanish, by the way.
Okay, great. And now I think we have time for one or two more things. So, what do you guys think? We could do partial false friends and then end with 10 false friends, English and German. But I think
Yeah,
we could do some partial false friends. What do you think?
just this, and then I'd like to hear something about the false friends between Spanish and German. That would be interesting. Yeah.
Great. Well, why don't we start by defining what's the difference between false friends and partial false friends?
Yeah, well, again, if they are partial false friends, it means that the two words being compared, one in Spanish, one in English, may work as cognates, as true friends in certain contexts, but not in other contexts. So you need to look at the whole thing to see whether the translation fits or does not fit. I mean, the equivalent you have in mind, not the translation. And one is the word offense. If you take the word offense and the Spanish ofensa, now we go from English to Spanish, you may say, well, they mean exactly the same thing. They're good friends, let's say. They're true friends. They're true cognates. Yeah, and that's all right in many contexts. Me ofendí, me ofendiste. I can say, I took offense at that, right? So that's all right in certain contexts. In legal Spanish, in legal English, sorry, offense, as we all know, is typically used in the criminal field to mean a crime. It's a more or less synonymous with crime and in most contexts interchangeable with crime. So when you translate it into Spanish, you should say delito and not ofensa. Look, if you're talking about uh, horrid things like homicides or rape, you would never say that el homicidio o la violación son ofensas. They are delitos. And in certain jurisdictions, not in Argentina, for instance, the word crimen is a technical word. It's used in the law, it's used by legal scholarship with a particularly technical meaning. That's not the case in Argentina. We do not have, or in Uruguay or Chile, we do not have a classification that enforce, I mean, that distinguishes between a delito and the crimen. Crimen is a word we very often find in the media. It's very commonly used uh, on social media as well, but the technical word is delito. So the confusion to avoid there is offense, offensa, what you mean is delito.
Great. And this actually brings us to one of my other favorite terms, starting from, condena and expropiación. In English, condemnation, to be condemned, or I condemn you. It's very similar to defamation, and I've been defamed. I think it's just so highbrow and posh and fancy, and maybe with religious overtones. Does this obviously is partially a false friend, right?
Exactly. And these religious overtones are found everywhere in legal English. Think about the plaintiff, think about the prayer for relief. At the end of a pleading, you pray for relief. Oh, it's so interesting. But anyway, yeah, I remember a friend of mine saying, someone has told me that their house or their apartment, let's say a house in California, has been condemned. And he asked, pero ¿se puede condenar a una casa por algo que hizo? No, las casas todavía no hacen cosas malas. So, again, to condemn may mean condenar in certain areas, especially in general Spanish and English. But when it comes to legal English in the area of real property, in particular real estate, if property is condemned, what we mean is it's taken for public use, for a public purpose. Depends on the definition you get, but it's what we call expropiar. In Spain, the concept is expropiación forzosa. That's the name you get in the statute dealing with this matter, which I think is a bit redundant because if it's expropiación, I mean, an act decided by the government, by the authority, which you practically cannot oppose except in certain circumstances. It's, of course, forcible, it's forzosa, but anyway, so it's expropiación in Spanish, condemnation in English. Now,
But
in
condemnation in English, what would
in
that be
America,
in Spanish? So if a building is condemned, for example,
claro,
what?
el edificio fue expropiado.
Huh.
Sí,
Interesting.
It's
Because
expropriate.
expropriation is typically there's a difference between expropriation as a taking, where your property has been taken by another, and in U.S. practice, although I'm not a real estate attorney, uh, when a property is condemned, it's not in the sense of an expropriation, but rather typically for health code violations
I
or
know.
other safety violations. It's condemned
Well,
in the sense that it's not been taken, but it's been prohibited from use.
I know. That varies from one jurisdiction to another. I've done extensive research into this because I've taught a number of courses in expro- expropriation and condemnation. Yeah, in the United States, you've got certain jurisdictions in which, if a property looks so derelict that it's uninhabitable, you say that it's condemned for use, and no one can live in it until it is restored to uh, conditions of habitability. However, you will find a lot of cases in the end. There's a lot of case law on condemnation. For instance, a new highway is being built, so the property at the sides needs to be condemned. A number of acres are
So in
condemned.
that sense, we would say expropriated. So if you own a piece of land and they want to build a highway through it on that land, they will expropriate your property. There's a lot of fights over this continually as to whether you've been paid fair value or not, or whether the government even has the right to expropriate the property. We
Oh,
I wouldn't typically think of that as being condemned. I would think of that as being expropriated, which I
yeah,
think is what you refer to as la expropiación forzosa. No?
exactly,
Okay.
exactly. But I insist that there may be differences between all 50 states, and you will find a lot of condemnation proceedings and acts dealing with condemnation in this sense you mean, that is expropriated for public use. Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah,
Now, I'd like to continue with the religious themes with absolvar, because, if someone has sinned and perhaps they're in a state where they'd like to be absolved for those sins. In the court, there's actually another word that starts with A. We normally say he has been acquitted. I don't trust him, but he was acquitted by the court. It
e-
wasn't beyond a reasonable doubt.
exactly. And the pair here is absolve and absolver, absolver, absolve. Yes, to absolve has a religious feel to it, as we all know, and you can say that someone has been absolved from guilt or from his or her misdeeds and whatever. But the typical technical term in courtroom use is not to absolve, but to acquit. And what you get if you're declared not guilty is not an absolution, but an acquittal. So again, absolve would work in English if you're talking about religious matters, but not about criminal matters as they stand today. Right.
Great. And then piggybacking on that, we also have potentially royal or real, because Real, like Real Madrid. I think most English speakers would say that's the real Madrid, not like the fake Madrid, Athletic, right? And but as far as I've been in Spain for a little while, and I think the king paid a visit, and he made them royal. And this actually has something to do with legal English. Am I? What do you have to say about that?
Yes. The word real, the adjective real in Spanish, again has at least two meanings. Yeah, I mean, one of them is, of course, real, verídico, verdadero. That's true. Another one is real, meaning royal, perteneciente a la monarquía, los reyes. But the interesting thing about real in legal Spanish is that it can be traced back to the Latin res or res, R-E-S, which means thing. Uh, so in Spanish, we've got this long tradition of uh, uh, this development on derechos reales, which mean rights that you may have in and to property of different kinds. Maybe ownership. It may be what we call usufruct. It may be co-ownership. Well, there are different derechos reales, and they're rights in and to a thing, without making any distinction about the kind of thing or the kind of property you're talking about. Whereas real, in the phrase real property in English, points only to immovable property, property that cannot be moved, an apartment, an office, whatever. But for instance, an automobile, a car, will not be considered real property, right? Uh, so in English, real has a narrower meaning or scope of meaning than real in Spanish. And this is a common mistake also, to speak about todos los derechos reales. Alguien, se habla en un contrato de todos los derechos reales que una persona posea sobre un determinado bien, mueble o inmueble. And that goes to English as all rights in and to real property. That's a big mistake because you're leaving out all that is not real property, meaning all personal property, right? So, real in Spanish has a broader meaning. It refers to property in general, to things, whereas real in English points only to immovable property. So
Great.
those are the false cognates.
Wonderful. So
But
that
Ricardo, so the concept of in rem that we
Yeah.
use in U.S. legal English, at least, I'm not sure about the U.K. or Canada. Do you want to discuss kind of the Spanish equivalents, just so that the Spanish speakers understand a little bit about this concept of in rem?
Oh, well, I think that in REM is a way out when we translate derecho real or derechos reales into English. Again, except for Louisiana, which of course has real rights as opposed to personal rights, outside that jurisdiction, it's improbable that someone will properly understand what you mean by real rights. Maybe, as Charlie said, you will think that that means true rights, right? So we use rights in rem, although it sounds a bit posh again, but because it means that rights in and to a thing,
And that,
rights
and
in
you'll hear lawyers talk about in rem rights or
or
rights
in
in
rem
rem
rights.
often.
Exactly. Uh, in general, also there's another distinction, that is when you speak about actions, actions may be in rem or in personam. And if they are in rem, it means that there is property that you can execute, property that you can seek execution on in case of non-compliance uh, by the debtor. And in personam, that has to do with claiming money, for instance, from somebody without having any property to rest on, let's say.
To execute against. Yes,
Exactly.
absolutely. I see we're
okay.
getting late on time. Charlie, do you want to talk a little about some of the
Please.
German terminology?
Absolutely. So, just so everyone knows, I have studied a very, very little bit about German. Ricardo has studied considerably more. Steve, have you studied any German?
I learned the alphabet and numbers
So, Steve knows.
in a Volkswagen on the way to East Berlin, or rather West Berlin, before the walls fell, and that's the extent of my German,
Okay,
unfortunately.
excellent. So, because as a thank you to all our listeners in Germany, all the German lawyers, I thought we did a lot of Spanish to English, false friends. Let's do some for German to English. The first one is gift. Ricardo, what do you think? Well, I told you before the show, but what do you think gift is in German?
Oh, something to be afraid of.
So gift actually means poison. So normally you would buy a gift before you go to someone's house, right, if you go for dinner. Apparently, gift is poison in English, and what you should be saying is Geschenk. Now, I think this is a false friend in Spanish and German. Steve, what do you think fabric is?
Uh, I have a very nice fabric in this shirt, and I'm very pleased with it. No,
Okay,
is that
but Ricardo, what's fabric in Spanish? Like, what's the cognate there?
It's factory.
Yeah, fabrica, right? So it's factory, which I thought was a surprise just now when I thought because I hear about fabricas all the time. Apparently, in German, it's stuff.
Stoff. Yeah.
And this is kind of funny because we say spend, but German spenden is to donate. And
uh,
so, if I'm going to spend money, I'm not necessarily donating it. If I go to the grocery store to spend money, I'm not donating it. So that's another false friend.
so if
Uh,
I say ich spenden meine deutsche Mark, that doesn't mean I'm spending my German
it means you're being
marks.
very generous and probably donating to people in need. This
Probably, probably a fool because you're not aware of the false cocktails. Right.
Yes. Well,
um,
fool anyways, but yes.
Ricardo, you may remember this. What's a gymnasium in German?
Oh,
Ah,
yeah. In Spanish, we'll say gimnasio as well, like the gym. Yeah. But in Germany, it's secondary school,
Yeah, exactly, high school. And
high school.
so, but a gymnasium for us, if I go to the gym, nobody says gymnasium anymore. But if I go to the gym, I go to apparently the Turnhall or fitness studio, which is stolen
Goodness.
from English, obviously. What if you pay the rent? If you're paying the rent, any ideas?
Mm-mm.
No,
No.
you're paying into your pension. The rent.
Oh,
rent is pension.
Yeah, and so rent in German is Mieten. I would love to know how my pronunciation is. But yeah, rent is pension, which would be Mieten. And to wink, so you close one eye because you find someone very attractive. To wink, any idea? Very similar.
no. I
No,
don't know that
it
one.
is
No.
to wave. Not if you're
Oh,
winking, you know what I mean. Not exactly legal English. Um, what about fast? Fast is like yeah, almost, soon, or schnell. Next, okay, so this is really similar for Spanish and German. What do you think brand is?
mm, just brand.
No, no, because
Uh,
it's obviously
I'm not sure. I'm trying to think of a Spanish word that is similar to that one. I can't think of one. But
it's marca.
marca. All right. Okay.
Yeah, well, they would say it more German, like I assume mark, but it's marca, so you'd be like Adidas is
So
a famous
I got confused. So mark is the German word for brand.
brand. Actually means fire.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if there's a brand you got to run and you're looking for a marca, God, I hope I'm getting this right because this is three languages all at once. To become, let's say, I have become a man. I've turned 18. Uh, it's actually to get. So becoming is to get. It's not to become. To
Yeah.
become would be werden. Werden. This one may not be good for mastering legal English, but here we go. The German word "dick" means thick. And we can just leave it there. But das ist dick would be that is thick.
I think the music's supposed to come on now to drown us
should have left that. Should have left that for last.
out.
It's all language. Look, it's all language.
You can get this, I'm sure. What's
We're
chef?
not. We've now come first full circle from my introducir
Yeah, and
to yes, yes.
Chef has got to be pretty easy though. Chef, I assume one of you can get. What's chef?
I
You can
have no idea.
boss.
boss. Oh yeah.
Balls.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're the kitchen chef.
Ah,
And then beware my wand, or beware the wand is beware the wall. And the last one, mist, like you'd be like, oh, there's a lot of mist in the air. It's a beautiful morning. Apparently, mist is manure.
yeah,
Yeah, oh,
there you
you knew
go.
that?
Yeah,
Okay,
it's
great. So,
manure is a nice way to put it, I think.
yeah.
I think it's appropriate for me to say here, ich verstehe nicht. Uh,
Oh wow, we have what I think is potentially some German in there, but it's beyond me in the comments. Thank you, Sophia. Um, I wanted to end, if that's all right with you two, about how I know a lot of students come to me, or a lot of listeners, they will be concerned about their level of English, and they're concerned, will I get to professional fluency with legal English? And I thought, for Ricardo, you've really English is your second language. When did you start learning? Was it always easy, or what do you have? You have a lot of students. I was just wondering, any words to someone who has stopped practicing for a while, and anything you would say to them?
Yes. Well, in my case, I started to learn English when I was a kid, when I was 6, 7 years old, and I've been studying English my entire life, and I continue to study English. I always say to my students, at least 20 minutes a day, try to learn something new, try to go back to what you think you know. Now, what I've mostly done is read a lot, listen to a lot of English, all varieties, and I have had the chance of being a teacher for so long that I've had the chance to use my English, my spoken English, uh, quite regularly, much more than many people out there who probably learn a language like English and do not have the opportunity to use their spoken English. So they're just developing their receptive, passive skills, like just listening, just reading, and they're never writing to anybody, they're never speaking to anybody. So try to find people you can talk to, whether physically or virtually, I mean, in person or now by any of these virtual means available to us. Try to copy what you hear. Choose a particular accent if you feel comfortable with it. I've never felt comfortable with any. So my English is kind of mid-Atlantic. You never know where it is exactly, but try to imitate all features. Try to capture what you read, what you want from what you read, from the point of view of new words, idioms, combinations. Do not learn words in isolation. Words in isolation do not work. Learn combinations, right? There's no good in learning, I don't know, the word cirugía if you do not know what to do with it. ¿Qué pasa con una cirugía? Me hice una cirugía. Well, in English, you undergo surgery. Well, there's nothing. It's no good learning the word surgery alone if you don't know how to use it. Then, so try to put things together all the time. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. We all make mistakes because it's a second language, and we are always uh, improving our second languages. And try to listen to as much video and recording materials as you can, at least 20 minutes, but always for a purpose. What do you want to do? You want to get the gist of what someone said? Do you want to learn particular vocabulary about something? I don't know. You're listening to something about a hurricane. Okay, you want to learn vocabulary about natural disasters? Go there, but always for a purpose, and do it regularly. Regularly means all the time. There's uh,
but I do. I wanted. I
never
need to
stop.
jump in. There's two things, especially for the Spaniards, because Spanish television for so long has dubbed all the television shows and the movies. This is one of the big reasons why Spaniards have had such a difficult time learning English and other foreign languages, is because they watch and listen to everything dubbed. So I would say strongly, I don't know about Argentina if it's like that, but I would strongly suggest that you switch the audio to the original English. You can have subtitles in Spanish if you want, but you need to continue accustomizing yourself. I don't think that's correct, but acclimating yourself to the pronunciation. And secondly, I would strongly suggest, this is my personal opinion and preference, that you learn American English rather than British English. And the only reason for that is because the Spaniards, less so the Argentines. The Argentines, because of that Italian influence, have more of a sing-song, up and down intonation. But the Spaniards speak in a monotone very similar to the Americans. And when the Spaniards try and copy the British accent, it's usually, how should we put it charitably, a disaster. Basically, it makes it much more difficult to understand the speaker when you have this mangled British accent. This is, again, a personal preference, but I would say it's much easier and more effective to learn with the American accent than with the British accent. And I will stop waving the flag at this point. Sorry.
Yeah, and you tackled this issue in episode 2, Charlie and Steve, when you discussed phonetics, how to pronounce a number of words. I think that's of the utmost importance too. I mean, maybe your phonology in general is not that good. Mine is not. I mean, maybe your intonation will not always be the correct one, although we know that that is a feature that conveys meaning as well. But please make sure that you also learn how to pronounce things, the right phonetics for each word. I remember we mentioned cases like, I don't know, someone saying, I will purchase a new house. And you say purchase. Purchase does not even call back any meaning you can think of
Right.
if what you mean is purchase. So always try to look up the phonetics, the right way to pronounce a
Absolutely.
word you're using. Yeah.
Yeah, and if your pronunciation is good, then you can actually have a really delightful accent. I have two new students, one from France and one from Austria, and I really like the Austrian and the French accent. But if people are mispronouncing, that's when it starts to really kind of, you struggle to listen to them at length, that's
Yeah.
when it starts to sound bad.
Having an
Uh,
accent is not a problem at all whatsoever
but
in
it
and of
is a
itself.
big, it'll stop people from even speaking, and then they don't speak, and then they don't get better, and so that does come up quite a
But
bit.
But
before
never
we
give
end,
up.
I know
Do
we need
not
to
give up.
end. Oh, I just wanted to make sure that we note a couple of the comments that were made. Like Cesario was talking about sentencia firme, and I
Mm.
wanted to know what you think about, kind of the best English functional equivalent of sentencia firme. Um, did you
Yes,
have any thoughts on that?
yes, sure. Uh, um, las sentencias, what we call sentencias, can be classified in many ways. And one of them has to do with the effect of that sentencia. A sentencia definitiva is the one that puts an end to a proceeding. It comes at the very end, but it does not mean that it cannot be appealed, right? So a sentencia definitiva may be a sentencia definitiva de un tribunal de primera instancia. So it is just a final judgment of a court of first instance, as we say, or a trial court, whatever. Now, a sentencia firme is a different technical concept, and it means that it's one that can no longer be appealed or challenged by any other means. So, in English, we typically say final and binding, final and conclusive. But I remember that 20 years ago, remember, Steve, 22 years ago, when I was in New Jersey and then in Phoenix teaching these courses, there were a couple of lawyers who made interesting uh, contributions. One of them was one of the lawyers was from Texas, if I'm not mistaken. He said, "Look, in my jurisdiction, final and binding means nothing. I mean, if a decision is final, it is binding necessarily. So I think that the best choice is the phrase final and non appealable, or
That's what I was going
final
to say.
and
Yeah.
unappealable, or final and enforceable. Because if it is enforceable, yes, you can ask the court to enforce the judgment, right? It
Uh,
cannot go to an upper court.
I mean, I'd be careful there because it can be enforceable, but still be appealable.
All right. Okay.
So
Okay.
I would just say be
But
careful in the way you
final
use it.
and non-appealable would be better then. Yes, but that's what
And
we
I
would
just
choose.
wanted to call out
Yeah.
Sophia's last comment, where she was stating basically that in rem refers to land, as you were pointing out, Ricardo, and in personam, I think she wanted to say in personam has to do with the person
Yeah.
in UK or Australian common law.
Yeah. With the brief clarification that when we say that something in rem attaches to land, we are using land. I think the listener is using land in the broad sense, meaning real
Yes,
property. It did not
real
be
property.
just land proper. Yeah.
Right.
Yes, I agree.
Okay,
All right.
great. Thank you. Yeah, I misread that. I was stuck in my German. Now, as always, we want to thank our sponsors for making this possible. Of course, Charlie Sham Coaching. If you need to improve your legal English, let me know. You can send me a direct message on LinkedIn. Steve Connor, you and your wonderful foundation. Huh?
Juriscribe provides translation and related legal and linguistic services to law firms, corporate counsel, and other parties, both in the United States and in Europe. And we'd be happy to help you with your legal translation needs.
Ricardo, would you like to invite anyone to contact you?
Well, yes, I'm not on social media, so it will be a bit different, a bit difficult. But you can contact me via Colegio de Traductores Públicos here in the city of Buenos Aires. My email address is there. I'm a freelance translator working particularly for law firms now. And I specialize, of course, as I said, in English, Spanish translation. I do other languages, but not for uh, things legal.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you for being with us, being our guest. I mean, for those listening, I think we got through half of what we could have. So if you really want more, we could finish what we've prepared in a following episode if there's big demand. So thank you, Ricardo, for coming, and
Thank you guys for the invitation. It was a
and,
pleasure.
and thank you
Excellent. Thank
everyone
you so much.
for listening.